The rain poured relentlessly that evening, mirroring the turmoil in Lisa's heart as she stood by the doorway, suitcase in hand. Her husband, Daniel, lay weak on the couch, his eyes filled with silent pleading. She had convinced herself that leaving was the only option, that she deserved a life unburdened by sickness and sacrifice. But as the years passed, the echoes of her choice haunted her. 2 years later, regret clawed at her soul, a relentless whisper in the dead of night. What have I done? 2 years had passed since Lisa walked out of that small apartment in Chicago, leaving behind a life she could no longer bear. At first, freedom had felt exhilarating, a fresh start, unshackled from the weight of Daniel's illness. She moved to Los Angeles, chasing the life she thought she deserved. New job, new friends, and no reminders of the man she had left behind. But regret had a way of creeping in when least expected. It started as a quiet guilt, a passing thought when she saw couples walking hand in hand, or when she heard a familiar song on the radio. Then it became unbearable. She wondered how Daniel had coped without her. Was he still alive? Did he hate her? One evening, after yet another sleepless night, she did something she had sworn never to do. She searched for him online. Her hands trembled as she typed his name, fearing what she might find. The first result was an article from a local Chicago newspaper. Community comes together to support terminally ill man. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The article featured a picture of Daniel, thinner, weaker, but unmistakably him. It spoke of kind neighbors who had stepped in after his wife left, of volunteers who helped with his medical bills, of a woman named Emily who had been by his side through it all. Emily. Lisa scrolled through the photos attached to the article, her heart pounding. There was Daniel, smiling softly despite his frail state, and beside him Emily, a woman with warm eyes and a gentle presence. A woman who had stayed when Lisa had not. For the first time in 2 years, Lisa felt the full weight of her actions. The freedom she had chased felt hollow. Had she truly believed she could outrun her conscience? Tears blurred her vision as she whispered to the empty room, "What have I done?" Lisa sat frozen in front of her laptop, staring at the article. Every word on the screen felt like a dagger to her chest. She had convinced herself that Daniel would be fine without her, that he would find a way to manage. But seeing his frail figure, the kindness of strangers stepping in where she had walked away, it shattered every lie she had told herself. Her mind spiraled back to the night she left. Daniel had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis a year before she walked out. At first, she tried to be strong. She took care of him, drove him to doctor's appointments, managed the medications. But as his condition worsened, so did her resentment. The man she had married, the one who once made her laugh until her stomach hurt, became a shadow of himself. And she became a nurse, a caretaker, a woman suffocating in a life she hadn't signed up for. That night, as Daniel dozed on the couch, too weak to get up and see her off, she had stood at the door hesitating. A part of her had wanted to turn back, but she had silenced that voice, convincing herself that she deserved more. She walked away and never looked back. Until now. Lisa scrolled further through the article, her heart pounding. The community had rallied around Daniel. A local charity had raised funds for his medical care. Volunteers had helped with house chores. And then there was Emily, the woman who had stepped in where Lisa had stepped out. The article mentioned that Emily was a physical therapist who had initially started helping Daniel as part of her work but had grown close to him over time. There were pictures of them together. Emily pushing his wheelchair in a park, Daniel smiling despite the obvious toll of his illness. Lisa shut her laptop abruptly. What was she expecting? That she could waltz back into his life and be forgiven? That he would want to see her after what she had done? Yet, she couldn't ignore the weight in her chest, the gnawing guilt that had only grown heavier with time. For the next few days, she tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like a second skin. She went to work, met friends for coffee, scrolled through social media, but everything felt meaningless. She had spent 2 years trying to erase Daniel from her past, only to realize that he was still very much a part of her. And so, one evening, against all reason, she booked a flight back to Chicago. The city was just as she remembered, cold, gray, and buzzing with life. As the taxi pulled up to Daniel's neighborhood, her hands felt clammy. The apartment complex looked the same, yet something about it felt different. She wasn't sure what she was expecting. To knock on his door and see his reaction? To apologize? What if he told her to leave? What if he couldn't even look at her? Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked towards the building. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached his apartment door. She hesitated, then finally knocked. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened and there he was. Daniel. Thinner than she remembered. His once bright blue eyes now tired and sunken. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And then, from inside the apartment, a voice. Daniel? Who is it? Lisa's stomach twisted. Lisa's breath hitched as she stood frozen in the doorway. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. Neither anger nor surprise, just quiet exhaustion. The kind of weariness that came from years of hardship, the kind she had once run away from. From inside, soft footsteps approached. A moment later, Emily appeared beside him. She was younger than Lisa had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark brown hair tied loosely behind her head. There was a warmth in her eyes, the kind that made people feel safe. She wore a simple sweater, comfortable, familiar, like she belonged there. And maybe she did. Lisa felt a sudden wave of nausea. What was she doing here? What did she expect? Emily glanced at Daniel before turning to Lisa, her posture shifting slightly. Not hostile, but guarded. She had no idea who Lisa was yet, but she seemed to sense the tension thickening the air. Lisa wanted to speak, to explain, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He exhaled softly, stepped back, and without a word, left the door open. Lisa hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The apartment was different now. It still had the same small living room, the same scuffed wooden floors, but there were changes. A new recliner where the old couch used to be, a walker near the wall, a shelf filled with neatly arranged bottles of pills and medical supplies. And it was cleaner than she had ever kept it. Lisa stood awkwardly near the entrance, hands clasped in front of her. Daniel moved to the recliner and sat down carefully. His hands, once strong, trembled slightly as he adjusted himself. Emily walked past Lisa, retrieving a blanket from the couch and draping it over Daniel's legs with a natural ease. as if she had done it 1,000 times before. Lisa felt like an intruder in a life that had moved on without her. Her eyes darted to the framed photographs on the shelf. One caught her attention immediately. A picture of Daniel sitting in a park, a small dog curled at his feet, Emily beside him, laughing. He looked happy, genuinely happy. Had he forgiven her, or had he simply learned to forget her? She finally found the courage to look at him again. He was watching her, his expression still unreadable, but something in his gaze felt final. Lisa had spent the past 2 years believing she was the victim of bad timing, of an unfair fate. But standing here now, she realized the truth. Daniel had suffered, yes, but not because she left. He had suffered because of his illness, because of his failing body, because life had been cruel to him. But she had been the one to abandon him. And now, after all this time, she had returned, not for his sake, but for her own. The weight of her own selfishness crushed her. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze one last time. And then, finally, she did the only thing she could. She turned and walked out the door. The cold Chicago air hit Lisa's face as she stepped outside, but it wasn't nearly as harsh as the realization settling deep in her chest. She had thought coming back would bring her closure, that somehow seeing Daniel again would allow her to mend the past. But there was nothing to mend. She had been gone too long, and in her absence, life had gone on without her. Her steps felt heavy as she moved down the sidewalk, barely aware of where she was going. The city hummed around her, indifferent to her turmoil. Cars rushed past. Pedestrians chatted as they walked by. The world continued moving just as it had the day she left Daniel behind. Lisa found herself in a small coffee shop a few blocks away, hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. Her mind replayed the brief encounter over and over. The way Daniel looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, but with something far worse, indifference. For the past 2 years, she had believed that regret would destroy her, that if she let herself feel the full weight of what she had done, it would consume her entirely. But the truth was, Daniel didn't need her regret. He didn't need her at all. And that was the real punishment. She stared at the steam rising from her cup, her thoughts spiraling. What now? She had spent so much time running, from guilt, from responsibility, from the image of the man she had once loved turning into someone she couldn't recognize. But what had running ever given her? An empty apartment in Los Angeles, meaningless conversations with acquaintances who didn't really know her, a life that felt more like a carefully constructed escape than something real. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She hadn't left because Daniel was sick. She had left because she was afraid. Afraid of watching someone she loved deteriorate. Afraid of the sacrifices it would take to stay. Afraid of becoming trapped in a life she didn't want. But Emily hadn't been afraid. Emily had stayed. Lisa closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She would never be able to undo what she had done. She would never be able to rewrite the past, to take back the nights Daniel spent alone, the moments he needed her and she wasn't there. But maybe, just maybe, she could start making different choices now. For the first time in years, she pulled out her phone. Not to check social media, not to distract herself, but to look up something real. Volunteer programs, support groups, charities for patients with chronic illnesses. She didn't know if she could ever forgive herself, but maybe she could learn to be someone better than the woman who had walked away that night. Maybe it was too late to make things right with Daniel. But it wasn't too late to make things right with herself. Lisa spent the next few hours in that coffee shop, scrolling through pages of volunteer organizations and medical support programs. She had no idea where to start, only that she had to. The next morning, instead of taking a flight back to Los Angeles, she found herself walking into a local hospice center. The air smelled of antiseptic and faint lavender, the quiet murmur of nurses filling the halls. She had called ahead, asking if they needed volunteers. They always did. At first, the work was simple: bringing water, sitting with patients who had no family, reading to those who could no longer see well enough to do it themselves. It was uncomfortable at first, but then slowly she learned. She learned how to listen, how to be present without looking for an escape. Weeks turned into months. For the first time in years, Lisa stopped running. One afternoon, as she was helping an elderly woman adjust the blanket on her lap, she heard the front doors of the hospice open. She turned, expecting a nurse or visitor. It was Emily. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared past hung heavy in the air. But Emily wasn't here for confrontation. Lisa straightened, bracing herself for whatever came next. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "I saw your name on the volunteer list." Lisa nodded, unsure of what to say. Emily studied her for a long moment before offering the smallest of smiles. "He would have wanted this." Lisa felt something deep inside her crack open. Not pain, not regret, but something softer. A kind of peace she never thought she would find. Emily didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked down the hall, disappearing into one of the patient rooms. Lisa let out a slow breath and turned back to the woman in the wheelchair, adjusting the blanket a little more securely before taking her hand. Maybe she couldn't change the past. But for the first time in a long time, she was finally where she was meant to be.